Hello, everyone. Today I am here with Lisbeth Sewell. She is the CEO and co-founder of Sparkle Stories, based in Austin, Texas. She creates original audio stories for children with co-founder David Sewell McCann. Sparkle aims to transform children's media, bringing gentler, kinder experiences to families. They now have over 1,400 original audio stories for children ages 3 and up. You can find them at sparklestories.com. Hello, Lisbeth.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to chat.
Yes. Can we begin with you sharing a little bit about how you came to this work?
Sure. So probably 13 years ago now, Sparkle was born. The idea for Sparkle was born actually out of a hard time. We had been really, it was so many things, right? It was the financial challenges. It was the health challenges. It was the young parents raising kids. It was a lot. And the idea came to me kind of in this, I believe in a higher power. And so it felt like a divine flash to me, because we had been saying, what do we do with our gifts on this planet? And I got this image of David, who is an extraordinary storyteller. He can tell stories off the top of his head, right? Like you can throw him a couple topics and all of a sudden out comes this incredible story. And I had this picture of this little teeny business where we put stories online. I didn't know much more than that. And it would be for families like us we were no media. We were a Waldorf family at the time, and we had no media in our house, but I wanted something for my kids, particularly at this moment when I was having this download. My kids were sick, right? And I'm like, there are no audio stories out there.
Yeah.
And granted, this is 13 years ago, pre-podcast, right? And so I got this feeling, and I said to David, we got to start a little teeny business, and we're going to start putting your stories online. And then within a year and a half, families enjoyed them so much, we quit all outside work and just started doing that. And so ever since then, that's what we've done. It's kind of a cool, blessing of a story. Most businesses like this don't have the good grace of that kind of easy fortune. And we're just both people that it did. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I love that kind of divine inspiration and just trusting the process and just going with your gifts. That's one of the things that I'm kind of trying to bring across in this summit for a lot of parents. Not necessarily that they are going to, be able to quit their jobs and stay home and start a business, but that they have divine gifts that if we trust the process, they will be used the way they are supposed to be used. So
and know that we work double time. I worked full time in the day and then did that at night until it was sustainable enough. And luckily it was just within a year and a half to then start not working as much. So
Awesome. So you say that you should choose the stories you listen to as carefully as you would choose the food that you eat. Could you describe a little bit more what you mean there?
Well, let me talk about it first from an adult perspective, and then I'll talk about it from a child perspective. Okay. I don't know about you, but I notice if I do things like tune into the news a lot, or if I watch content that has violence or hyperstimulation in it, I find that my nervous system gets really off, right? Whether I start to just feel more anxious or I'm agitated, it doesn't serve me. And then my mind will spend time circulating what I just witnessed. And then I started to recognize, this is some years ago now, I have to be really discerning about what I take in. I'm a highly sensitive person, number one, but I think this is true for all of us. How do I want to feel in a day? And then I'm going to choose what I engage with thoughtfully so that I feel good, right? And I want to know what's going on in the world, but you can make choices around that. And I think that's particularly true with children, that the content you expose them to can be nourishing, like good food. It can be filled with thoughtful, delightful, considerate stories that are age appropriate, or I find in a lot of contemporary kids media, it can have a lot of adult content, a lot of hyperstimulation, and you can even experiment with your children to see if I feed them, I'm going to say feed them stories that are nourishing with lovely storylines and thoughtful language and certainly age appropriate. How do they behave or how do they respond? What does their day look like versus access to lots of content that may not be directly appropriate to them or say particularly thoughtful. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Those words and images, they stay with us, right? And they make not only make an impression, but they can kind of influence the way we think about the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I like that you brought in that piece about the nervous system, because I think that's something that we are starting to realize more. And if you've watched the interviews all the way through, I'm speaking to the summit goers here,
Yes.
there will be talk about like trauma and grief and the effect that they have on the nervous system. So what Elizabeth is saying is really in line with that, about monitoring the nervous system and like trying to nourish it versus like overstimulating it. So
if I can say a little bit more about the way that we construct stories and the way that I would encourage people to construct stories. So David was a trained Waldorf teacher. He was an elementary teacher, and he learned how to not only choose gentle words, but modulate his voice and be thoughtful about his pacing, so that the stories themselves are meant to be nurturing. And hopefully we can talk about this within our time, but if parents are choosing to tell their own stories, like there are literally ways to tell that story that will help that child settle. Often children, I think, are hungry for that. They don't want to be entertained as much as they want to be connected and nourished,
Oh, yes.
Including with storytelling.
I love that. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Waldorf education. And and we wanted to talk a little bit, kind of tie in how stories can be used to inspire learning. Sure.
Well, there are several ways. And I'm going to use our own stories as the model. So Sparkle Stories was originally created by David. Before we had the idea for the business, he was telling stories in his classroom to help children through basically social emotional learning thresholds, right? So my first point will be that stories can be used to help children or model for children ways through their struggles. I'll give an example. Like, say a child is having fear at bedtime. This was a story David told to our own children to help them with this very thing. You can tell a story about that child by, say, turn them into a chipmunk and take them through the experience that's like common for them. It's bedtime, but my little body starts to feel tense. You know what I mean? The chipmunk starts to say, "Mommy, mommy, I want this, I want that." And then like weave a story that then in which the chipmunk has a successful bedtime, in which the success, either whether the chipmunk self-soothes or the chipmunk learns a lesson about, how to calm their bodies. And then the child then learns through that modeling, like, oh, it's almost like it becomes pattern in their brain. David would tell stories to his class about the children, granted turned into animals or other children, and the children would never get it. And the next day, the bullying issue would have dissipated because they would have used the tools that they learned in the story. So that's one thing. Also, stories can be great opportunities to introduce children to new concepts, to get them curious. Like, say, we're going to go in the woods tomorrow, and you want your child to be lit up and curious versus resistant. We're going on a hike. Stories about, magical, fairy life, or stories about, like the elves that live in the trees, or whatever it is that can, or even if it's like fairies as relates to, say, mushrooms, or as, plants, the flora and fauna of your area, then that can inspire curiosity, right? And then the last thing I would say is stories can teach for early learners, like stories pattern healthy, like reading patterns in the brain, right? So not only with like vocabulary, but learning to sort of assimilate ideas. And often you find that, like, that children that are read to often have more ease and facility with learning to read. So and you can also listen to stories about your subject matter. Like, we have stories about history and geography, and it doesn't, it goes way beyond textbooks. You can enliven your pedagogy with story time,
Yeah. I mean, there's just so many great stories in there. We use them in our home, and that's kind of how we got connected there. So
Thank you for saying.
So what would be some easy ways that parents can be like really intentional? You kind of touched on it, but like maybe give like your top 3 ways that they can use stories to educate.
Well, I would say from the pedagogy perspective, I
Yeah.
mean, from the social emotional learning perspective,
Uh-huh.
bedtime, if you're in a struggle, whether it's at home or in a classroom, in the evening time, right before sleep, is a great way to introduce new concepts or new ways of being in the world,
Mhm.
or sweet messaging that you want them to
Yeah.
take to sleep that then they incorporate. I know that a lot of families have a dedicated story time in the day that is a quiet time, right?
Mhm.
So if you, and I'm going to use Waldorf language,
Mhm.
have your out breath, like you in your if you're a homeschooler, say there's lots of activity and you want that in breath, that quiet time, Sparkle
Yeah.
is a great time to sit down and help children kind of unwind and settle back into themselves. And
Yeah.
granted, if that story happens to have something that's relevant to what they're learning, great, that's even better. Let's see, what else would I want to say about that? I mean, and I know there are families that when say studying the history of, United States history, then they pull in a daily or a weekly story from our 50 series in which we
Okay.
state by state and, hear
Mhm.
a story about a remarkable human from American
Mhm.
history in that state.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think those are my best suggestions. How do you use them?
I mostly use them for like when I need that quiet break. Like,
Yeah.
I still have, well, I have 9 kids, so
Yeah.
they're aged 18 to 1. And so I have been using them for many years, but just I like to have that like 1 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon quiet time.
Yes.
And so I find that like putting on, the kids used to be like really resistant to that. But
Okay.
then like when I'm like, oh, let's listen to our story, then it's like, oh, okay. Can we
Yeah.
do this one today? Can we do this one
Awesome.
today?
Yeah.
And so
You can't say
it,
enough about the value of giving the educator or the parent or caregiver a break, right?
yeah,
Totally. Yeah, totally. Awesome. I
yeah.
interrupted you. Finish your thought though.
Well, I was just going to ask, so even if a parent, like had mentioned, like sharing stories, like your stories with your kids, right?
Yeah.
And so even if a parent doesn't think that they are creative and maybe doesn't even think that like anything interesting happened to them, what would be some ways that they could share like family stories or cultural stories with their kids?
Totally, totally. And the first thing I want to say about that is particularly young children don't need great adventure tales. And they often enjoy stories about simple things that are very familiar to them. So if a parent literally wants to tell a simple story from a normal day of their childhood, like that includes details from their own home and backyard, children love that, right? I Actually, where I should have started is no story that we can ever create will really compete with what a parent tells their own child. Now, did your parents tell you stories? My dad told me mine. He told us.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was my dad. It was always like when we were going on long car trips,
Yes.
he made it special because we would like get in the car and we'd like be like, okay, Dad. And he'd be like, a long, long time ago when I was just a little boy. And then we were just like hooked from that.
Right?
So yeah.
And they're the best stories ever, and you will remember them forever. And I think that is just true in general. And you can then go from your own personal experience, like for me, I love to spend time in my backyard. And then you just, gently introduce a little fairy, or you introduce an animal, or you introduce something simple. And then, let the story unfold. And I think also for parents, you don't have to have the story figured out before you tell it. You just open your mouth and start, and often it will come to you. I mean, that's David has a gift like that. But if you just trust and let yourself have pauses, and you'll know what the next right thing is to do. And if it ends in the middle of like nowhere and it feels like an awkward ending, I don't even think your kids mind. They just love that you are sharing with them from your own heart and from your own experience. Don't you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have tried that sometimes and sometimes just like totally fanciful, and like our adult brain sometimes sometimes gets in the way and we're like, well, that doesn't make sense.
Yes.
But like your kids get it.
Yes, they totally do. They totally do. They totally do.
Yeah.
And I think you can also, in moments, if you feel really stuck, invite them into it. You just say, and then what happened? What do you think happened to Fanciful, the chick bug who, I think you used the word fanciful, I love this word, sitting on her log in the afternoon. And then suddenly it becomes a family storytelling time, right? Because kids love that particularly.
Yeah. So I like that you brought in like draw them into the story. What are your thoughts on like having kids share their own stories?
Oh, well, of course, I think that's the best, right?
Yeah.
And I think they generally naturally do. I don't know if you found that when you're 9. With my two Sure. And if you want to encourage that to happen, I think the most important thing you can do is make space for it and just get really present and let them spin their stories. And you can give them tools too. My kids, by the time they were probably 5 and 8, I had given them one of those old school tape recorders. So then they could make their own sparkle stories, right?
Yeah.
But I think just like making room, sitting back, making space, getting present, letting them tell their story. And if they get stuck, you can say, or if you want more from them, all you have to say is, tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. I think those are magic words. I think those are magic words for humans actually too.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. And it's like it just naturally comes, right?
Yeah.
What have you found?
You could also say, and then what happened?
Yes. And then what happened? Yes.
Yeah.
And then what happened? Yeah.
My 3-year-old.
And let them have space around it too, because I think often like everybody's timing is different. Everybody's creative timing is different. And so allowing yourself to be patient and let them mull too, and not to urge them on. And maybe the story wants to happen like later in the afternoon too, but the stories are there.
Yeah. I'm feeling very inspired by this conversation because I have a 3-year-old and she has like the craziest facial expressions, like when she is like in a story, and lots of times it's like really like off the wall, like she's telling you like why there's a mess in her room, and she's like, and then she's like coming up with like, and then this happened, and she's like, and so I'm going to use this and be like, oh really, and then what?
Yes. Yes.
I think that's a good way to do it, to encourage that creativity and just let it flow.
Yeah. And your interest and curiosity as a parent says everything too. Haven't you found that? Like our kids just love it when we sort of drop in and show up fully for them. I think that's the greatest gift a parent can give, honestly. And I think that whatever is opening in them opens more once you give them that gift.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super cool.
Yeah. And so you touched on this a little bit about like your family's vision and like having like a media-free home and really focusing on, the nervous system and not overstimulating it. But like, how do stories, for people who maybe are not familiar with Waldorf, maybe you could like kind of share a little bit about that and share like how stories can contribute to a peaceful home.
Oh, I see what you're asking. Yes, I can talk about that. Well, I'm going to have a little compare and contrast moment right now. And talk a little bit about like the neurobiological experience of story listening. So when a child is read to or a story is told to them, but they are experiencing a story without images. And my comparison would be images on a screen, and not quite the same with storybook. But when a story is told aloud to them and they're invited to create the world of that story in their mind, it's a whole brain experience. They've done brain scans of this sort of thing where the whole brain lights up, as you can imagine, right? You're experiencing the wall that the young princess is climbing over. You're experiencing the wind of the sails. You can, you're seeing, you're smelling, you're tasting, you're hearing, and the characters come alive. So it invites that young brain to really get engaged. And what they find, and what I found, and what 13 years of testimonials of families have found, is that the children in the story listening experience come out of that not overstimulated, but like nourished and satisfied and lit up, though, because they're often feeling inspired to create, whether that's with their hands or they want to act out what they've just listened to. And so we have found that in comparison to, say, the consuming screen media, the household becomes more peaceful because of the listening experience is nourishing and it's calming. Are you with me?
Yes.
Where I know in the brain scan experience that I read about and I saw, when one is presented with a lot of imagery on screen, like the images are formed for you, that tends to, and particularly with the light from a screen, it tends to light more of the primal part of your brain. And then we all know this, and we do it ourselves, that kids can be more stimulated, and they will have lots to work out there, but often their bodies and nervous systems are a little more agitated than they will work that out. I mean, how many times would my kids after a movie want to tussle with each other, because then they had the energy
Yeah,
from that. Yeah. And we used screen media in our household eventually and, welcomed it and found a way for it. But,
Mhm,
and we found that the rhythm of stories, and
mhm,
particularly if you make a rhythm of it, like your story time between 1 and 3 or your bedtime, and children start to look forward and know, like, this is the moment I'm going to wind down in the day, because I believe that children love regular routines.
mhm.
But then, like, they've got this sort of pattern in their day that they can lean into, and everybody knows, like, this is the moment we're going to wind down and experience something new, if only in our imaginations.
Yeah,
Yeah. Does that make sense?
yes.
Yes. That was
And so,
my little lecture on that, because I feel really strongly about it. And also I've witnessed it so much over the years that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is
yeah.
important. Parents should know this.
Well, and now that I have, kids that I have an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old, so
Yes.
they're
And
like,
mine are 21 and 18 now. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And so I'm sure you've probably experienced it, like when they go out and they're with their peers, right?
Yes.
And then like they're kind of like realizing a little bit like how different things were for them, but like how
Yes.
intentional, how when you're intentional as a parent to create that home environment that
Yes.
is safe for them, that they have a safe place that they can come home to, where they
Yes.
can have that peace, where they can have that calm, where they
Yes.
can be nourished. And
Yes.
then they are in an environment where, they're talking to people who didn't grow up that way. And it's like the light clicks on for them. And they're like, oh,
Yeah.
that's why we did things like this. And so
I don't think mine have landed there yet, but they definitely notice, and they do appreciate what we did as parents, but they definitely notice the difference. And yeah. Anyway, and I find that I like their emotional resiliency. I like how they know themselves, and I like how they know I think they've known a baseline of, and so they know that it's important to get back there,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there anything else you would like to add? Anything I've left out?
Let's see. What I want to say too, what I wanted to add in is, I know the overarching subject of this conference is growth mindset. And I want to talk a bit about that. Will you talk to me about how you use that, how you think about that with your kids? And then I would love to talk about that as that relates to stories.
Yeah. So the growth mindset comes from allowing growth in the parent, like personal growth is what I'm thinking here.
Yeah.
Personal growth where you have to like really go deep and do your personal work, your, demons, your issues, and work with that. So that's the first part of growth mindset. And then when you are really working with that, it allows you to be who you came here to be. And then it gives you the vision and the space to allow your children to be who they are meant to be, and to look for ways to help nourish that growth, to help them find the resources they need. So like if you have a kid that wants to be a screenwriter, or if you have a kid that wants to be a marine biologist, or wants to be a comedian, or, even if they just want to have a family, all of those things, you're able to like work with them, and you have the space and you have the capacity to help them grow because you are growing along with them. And so that's layer 2. And then layer 3 is that when we have so many people, when we have a baseline of people who have done the work, who are helping their children do the work, who are moving forward in that way, then the growth moves out into the larger culture.
Yes.
So that's the third layer.
Beautiful. Gosh, that's beautiful. Oh, that's so inspiring. I think relating to that, the last thing I would want to say, and this is for parents and kids alike, and this is something I've been thinking about and writing a lot with this new year, is like, what stories do you want to tell yourself? And to be really intentional about that, and not just from a like, how do I want to be entertained, but more like, what stories do you want to tell yourself and your kids about what's possible for you and them?
Yeah.
And to really like go after that. Because I think, like I was talking about, the media we consume, the stories we consume can be nourishing, or they can be challenging to our systems.
Yeah.
I think taking it a step further and even being like, I really want to hear stories, say, as an adult, about people who have embraced their creativity, their fullest creativity in their daily work lives, or, for your child, it could be specific to whatever their growth edge is, but like, but being thoughtful about like, what stories do we want to tell about what's possible for us? And again, this is my edge of growth right now. I'm using that as a tool, but I think it's a beautiful one because
I love that. What stories do we want to tell ourselves about what's possible and how we can get there?
And our kids, and for our kids too. Whether that's, again, it can be something simple or it could be something really big. But we are at a moment where we want a wholly different world. There's a lot of work to be done, as you said in one of our previous conversations, on this planet. And so I think it's really particularly important right now to start telling our kids stories about who they really most truly can be and are, so that we can bring more light and healing to the planet that we're on. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that we were able to connect and that you were able to do this interview with us.
Thank you. Thank you for including me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So if people want to find out more about you, I know you said that there's a free trial, which I highly recommend.
Yeah. Everybody that comes to Sparkle Stories there's no other way into Sparkle Stories other than trying it for free.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you go to sparklestories.com, and I think it's / free trial, but either way, any page you go on to, there's a button at the top that says start free trial. And there are free stories, you can test them. And if you want to check out the Sparkle Stories podcast, it's everywhere, Spotify, iTunes. We put a free story up a week as well there. So that's an easy entry point to try Sparkle Stories, because we want everyone to have access.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us for this interview, and we will see you tomorrow with another interview. Have a great day. Bye-bye.